Welcome back to Kural Inspired Stories, where ancient wisdom meets thrilling adventure. In each episode, we explore the timeless teachings of the Thirukkural through exciting stories filled with mystery, action, and lessons that still matter today. In today's episode, Kia and Neo are called back through the portal and find themselves in Vidharma, a city once known for its great wisdom. But something is wrong. People have stopped taking action, their reflections are fading, and the city's greatest minds have vanished into the endless maze. If you'd like to read along, grab a copy of The Mira and the Endless Maze on Amazon. Just follow the link in the description. Get ready for another exciting time-traveling adventure. Let's begin. Introduction. Kia and Neo had been back home for only a few hours, but their adventure in the past still felt like a dream. Had they really met Thiruvallur? Had they truly walked through the forgotten path and unlocked the first truth of the Thirukkural? Yet as they sat at the dinner table, their minds were still buzzing with questions. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, Kia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, staring at the moonlit ceiling, the words of the first Kural still echoing in her mind. Then, a sudden rustling sound from outside. Neo must have heard it too, because a second later he whispered, "Did you hear that?" The sound had come from Party's shed. As they crept outside, a strange sense of deja vu washed over them, and the cool night air sent chills down their arms. The shed door was slightly ajar. Inside, everything looked the same. The old books, the dusty shelves, the archway exactly where they had left it. And yet, something was different. Kia's eyes widened. A scroll lay open on the floor, its pages glowing faintly in the moonlight. Neo bent down and picked it up. His hands trembled as he read the single bold word written across the page. Irandu, the Tamil word for the number 2. Kia felt her heart race. It's calling us again. Neo swallowed. But we just got back. Before they could react, the archway trembled. The carvings along its surface flickered to life, glowing brighter, swelling faster. The portal was reopening. But this time, they weren't the ones who had activated it. Chapter 1. The Warning from Thiruvallur. Sunlight streamed through the leaves of a great tree, casting dapple shadows on the worn stone courtyard where Elder Thiruvallur sat, waiting for them. His parchment lay open on a low wooden table, a slender quill resting beside it. He smiled as they appeared. "You have returned," Thiruvallur said, his voice warm and steady. Kia and Neo exchanged excited glances before stepping forward. Their first adventure had changed the way they saw the world, and now it seemed another journey awaited them. Thiruvallur gestured for them to sit. "There is a place called Vidharma," he began, his gaze distant as if seeing the city through time. "It was once a land of both great thinkers and great doers, but something has changed. The people now believe that knowing is enough, that learning is the same as doing." Neo frowned. "But isn't knowledge important?" "It is," Thiruvallur agreed, nodding. "But knowledge without action is like an unlit lamp. It holds potential, but it brings no light." He folded his hands. "The people of Vidharma have lost something precious. Their reflections." Kia's eyes widened. "Their reflections?" Thiruvallur's expression darkened. Once in the center of their city stood a powerful artifact, the mirror of action. It was unlike ordinary mirrors. It did not merely show a person's face, it revealed their understanding, wisdom, and whether they applied what they knew in their daily lives. If a person acted on what they learned, their reflection was clear and strong. If they only gathered knowledge but never used it, their reflection would begin to fade. Neo's voice was hushed. "What happens when the reflections disappear completely?" Thiruvallur exhaled slowly. "They become lost in the endless maze." Kia felt a chill run down her spine. "A real maze?" "A maze of their own making," Thiruvallur said. "A place where they wander endlessly, caught in a cycle of debate and questioning with no action. They believe they are making progress, but in truth, they are trapped in circles, never moving forward." Neo sat forward. "Then we have to help them." Thiruvallur smiled, pleased by their willingness. Yes, it is time for you to go. The air around them shimmered. The courtyard began to dissolve. The last thing Kia and Neo saw was Thiruvallur lifting his quill, ready to inscribe the next Kural on his parchment. Then the world shifted, and Vidharma awaited. Chapter 2: The City Without Reflections. The moment Kia and Neo stepped into Vidharma, they were struck by its grandeur. The city stretched before them, a masterpiece of knowledge and debate. Towering libraries lined the streets, their massive shelves visible through grand arched windows. Stone plazas buzzed with scholars engaged in heated discussions, passionately debating philosophy, science, and governance. The air was filled with words, so many words, but something felt off. As they walked further in, they noticed a strange stillness beneath the energy of the discussions. Shops stood half built, their walls cracked but unrepaired. In the distance, a woman argued with a group of men over the correct way to bake bread, while the dough sat untouched and rose too long in the sun. Further along, a team of builders gathered around a half built home, pointing at architectural sketches and debating how to construct the most stable support beams. But the wood and stone remained where they had been left, untouched by tools. Even the children were not spared from this way of life. In a small courtyard, a group of them sat in a circle discussing the best way to play a game, but no one actually played. Kia and Neo exchanged glances. This is weird, Neo muttered. It's like they're stuck in a loop. Near the edge of the plaza, a man lay on a bench, sick and weak. Several healers stood around him, deep in debate. I believe the fever is caused by an imbalance in the body's heat, one declared. No, another interjected. We must first determine whether it is an infection or a simple weakness of spirit. A third shook her head. But what if it is a reaction to something he ate? Neo looked between them, then back at the pale, sweating man. Are they just going to stand there and talk? They're not helping him, Kia whispered. Neo's stomach twisted. These people weren't unkind. They were brilliant. They had so much knowledge, and yet they did nothing with it. Neo clenched his fists. This is ridiculous. As they turned away, something caught Kia's eye. A row of large mirrors lining the plaza walls. They reflected the city behind them, the buildings, the stalls, the wide stone paths, but something was missing. The people, Kia whispered. Neo followed her gaze. The people in the plaza appeared ever so faintly in the mirrors. You could barely see their reflections. Look at how weak their reflections are, he observed. Kia hesitated, then slowly stepped towards one of the mirrors. When she looked into it, her own reflection was there, nice and clear. Neo moved beside her. His reflection, too, was clear and solid, just as it should be. They turned back towards the crowd of scholars, healers, and craftsmen. They don't see it, Kia whispered. They don't even realize they're fading from the mirrors. Neo exhaled, his stomach twisting. They're losing their reflections. And they don't even know, Kia murmured. A quiet voice behind them made them jump. You noticed it too? They turned around. A girl, perhaps a few years older than them, stood nearby. Her dark eyes were sharp, scanning them with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Unlike the others, she wasn't standing still. She moved with purpose, her fingers tapping anxiously against the leather strap of the satchel slung across her shoulder. And most importantly, her reflection in the mirror was just a little clearer than the rest of the village. Chapter 3: The Endless Maze. The girl narrowed her eyes. You're not from here? Kia hesitated. No, we're here to help. The girl studied them for a moment before glancing around cautiously, as if making sure no one was listening. Come with me, she said, without waiting for an answer. She turned and strode away. Nia raised an eyebrow. She's not much for small talk, huh? Kia shrugged. Let's go. They followed her through winding streets and quiet alleys until they reached a deserted section of the city. The air here was still, untouched by the constant debates that filled the main plaza. The girl finally stopped near an old well, turning to face them. My name is Mira, she said, and if you notice the fading reflections, that means you're different from the others. Neo crossed his arms. So what's going on? Mira exhaled. You saw how people here are oblivious to the fact they are losing their reflections? Kia nodded. That's because they've lost the ability to truly see themselves, Mira said. They have just become obsessed with obtaining knowledge. She knelt by the well, pulling up a bucket of water. Look into this, she said. Kia and Neo stepped forward and gazed at the water's surface. Their reflections rippled clearly, but as the bucket tilted slightly, a second image appeared beneath them, a dark, twisting labyrinth. The people of Vidharma who have completely lost their reflections, Mira said, they're in the endless maze. Kia's pulse quickened. Where is this maze? Mira's expression darkened. The maze is beneath the city. It pulls in the people who have completely lost their reflections, but they don't even realize they're lost. They think they're still here, locked in endless discussions, never moving forward. Nia swallowed hard. How long have they been trapped? Years, Mira said, some of them almost a decade. Her voice lowered. My father is one of them. A silence fell over them. Kia's mind raced. Why does this happen? Mira's fist clenched. Because they kept gathering knowledge but never used it, and over time their reflections, their connection to themselves, faded away. She took a deep breath. And I'm afraid I'll be next. Neo took a step closer. But you still have your reflection. For now, Mira muttered, but it's fading. I can feel it. She hesitated. There's only one way to stop it. She turned, pointing to the center of the city. We have to go to the mirror of action. Chapter 4. The Mirror of Action. Mira's finger remained pointed toward the center of Vidharma, where a massive domed structure stood in the distance. This building looked forgotten, unlike the grand libraries or open debating halls that dominated the city. Its stonework was worn, and its once polished pillars were covered in vines and dust. The Hall of Reflections, Mira said. That's where the Mirror of Action is kept. Neo tilted his head. Wait, if the mirror is in the middle of the city, why doesn't anyone talk about it? Mira gave a humorless chuckle. Because no one cares anymore. The mirror stopped reflecting them, so they convinced themselves it didn't matter. Kia frowned. But it's still there? Mira nodded. Ignored, forgotten, but still there. Neo exhaled. Well, at least we don't have to go digging underground for it. Mira shot him a sharp look. Don't assume this will be easy. There was something in her voice, a mixture of urgency and fear, that made Kia's stomach twist. What's inside the hall, Mira? She asked quietly. Mira hesitated before replying. We need to get there before King Patri does. Kia and Neo exchanged glances. Who's King Patri? Neo asked. The ruler of Vidharma, Mira said, a note of frustration in her voice. He is the reason this city is the way it is. He believes that knowledge alone makes a person wise, that discussion is the highest form of intelligence, that action is unnecessary. Neo scoffed. Sounds like a real delight. Mira shook her head. He used to be different, she admitted. When he was younger, he believed in learning and doing, but somewhere along the way, he changed. Now, he's the strongest voice in Vidharma, the one who tells everyone that thinking about action is more important than action itself. Kia's eyes narrowed. And he knows about the mirror? Mira nodded. He knows, but he says it's just a relic of the past, that it's not relevant anymore. Neo ran a hand through his hair. So let me guess, he's not going to be thrilled when we try to prove him wrong. Mira's expression hardened. Not even a little. Kia squared her shoulders. Then we'd better move fast. The three of them stepped out of the quiet alley and back into the bustling city, making their way towards the Hall of Reflections. The moment they stepped onto the marble steps of the Hall of Reflections, Kia felt the weight of silence. Unlike the other buildings in Vidharma, which hummed with debate and conversation, this place was eerily quiet. The heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar, and the carvings were covered in layers of dust and neglect. It was clear that no one had entered in years. Neo pushed the doors open, and a gust of stale air rushed past them. The inside of the hall was massive, with its high dome ceiling arched like the inside of a great temple. But the light barely reached its corners, making the room feel almost endless in its shadows. In the center of the hall, standing on a raised platform, was the mirror of action. It was the size of a large doorway and had a dark polished stone frame. Unlike the other mirrors in Vidharma, which were gleaming and well maintained, this one looked old and forgotten, its once bright surface dulled with dust. And yet, something about it still felt powerful. Kia and Neo stepped forward. "This is it," Mira whispered. Kia hesitated, then took the final step onto the platform. The moment her foot touched the stone, a faint hum filled the air. The mirror stirred. Its surface, dull and dark just moments ago, began to shimmer as though coming alive. And then reflections appeared. Kia and Neo's images shone crystal clear, their eyes bright, their outlines solid. Mira's reflection flickered, unsteady but present. And then a fourth reflection began to take shape. It was weak and faint, like a shadow barely clinging to existence. The moment they saw it, a voice rang through the hall. "So," the voice drawled slow and measured, "the children believe they've uncovered something important." A tall figure stepped through the doors, his dark robes flowing around him. His face was lined with age and intelligence, his expression unreadable. Even without an introduction, Kia knew who he was: King Patri. Mira stiffened beside her. "Ah," Patri murmured, stepping closer. His gaze moved to the mirror of action, then back to the children standing before it. "It seems the mirror has decided to entertain you." Kia narrowed her eyes. "It's not just entertaining us, it's working." Patri chuckled. "Is it?" He took another step forward, glancing at his faint reflection. He did not seem surprised by its weakness. Neo crossed his arms. "So you admit it's showing the truth?" Patri smiled slightly. Truth is complicated." Kia clenched her fists. "No, it's not." She pointed at the mirror. "It reflects how much we apply our knowledge, how much we act on what we know, and you barely have a reflection at all." Patri sighed, almost as if he were amused. "Child, I have spent a lifetime learning. I have read every book and debated every theory. My knowledge surpasses anyone in this city, and yet you believe that a mere reflection should dictate my worth." Mira's voice was sharp. "It's not about worth. It's about understanding. If you truly understood all that you've learned, your reflection wouldn't be so weak." Patrick's expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Ah, Mira, always the little rebel." He turned his gaze back to Kia and Neo. "I see what you are trying to do. You believe this mirror is some kind of proof, a way to convince the people that their way of life is wrong, that our devotion to knowledge without action is flawed." Neo's jaw clenched. "Because it is." Patri raised an eyebrow. "And yet, look at our city. We are the most intelligent people in the land. We have progressed in ways others cannot comprehend." He gestured towards the door. "Do you really believe Vidharma needs saving?" Kia hesitated. Neo didn't. "Yes." Patri sighed as though speaking to a stubborn child. "And what do you propose? That we throw away all of our discussions? That we act without thought?" Kia took a deep breath. "We're saying that action and learning must go together, that knowledge means nothing if it isn't used." Patri watched for her for a long moment. Then he laughed softly. "You are idealists," he said. "And idealists are the most dangerous kind of fools." Neo took a step forward. "You don't understand." The ground beneath them rumbled. Neo froze. "What was that?" Mira's eyes widened in horror. "It's starting," she whispered. The mirror of action pulsed, its surface glowing brighter, and suddenly the ground beneath King Patri cracked open. Kia barely had time to grab Neo's arm before the floor beneath them collapsed, revealing a dark, shifting labyrinth below. The endless maze had awakened. Chapter 5: The Mirror Challenge. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Cracks spidered across the marble floor of the Hall of Reflections, jagged lines that pulsed with a strange energy. Kia's breath hitched as a deep rumbling noise echoed through the chamber, like the growl of something ancient awakening from a long slumber. The endless maze had begun to pull them in. Neo stumbled back, his heart racing. Okay, that's definitely not normal. Mira grabbed his arm. We have to move. Kia barely had time to react before a section of the floor near King Patri gave way. With a startled gasp, the ruler of Vidharma teetered on the edge of the widening chasm. For the first time since they had met, Patri looked genuinely startled. He reached out, grabbing at nothing as the ground beneath his feet crumbled into darkness. Kia lunged forward, her instincts kicking in before she could think. She grabbed his wrist just as he began to fall. For a moment, there was silence, just the sound of their heavy breathing and the distant hum of the mirror of action. Then King Patri looked up at her, eyes wide with disbelief. You, he murmured, struggling to process what had just happened. You don't have to fall, Kia said firmly. You just have to act. For a long moment, he didn't move. His fingers tightened around her wrist, but he still hesitated. Mira's voice rang out, King Patri, climb up! Patri looked down into the shifting abyss below him. The endless maze was waiting, twisting pathways, countless figures wandering aimlessly in circles, lost in their own endless debates. His own faint reflection shimmered within the dark paths. He was almost one of them. The moment stretched unbearably long. Then, finally, he acted. He grasped Kia's arm, shifting his weight forward, and with Mira and Neo's help, he pulled himself back onto solid ground. As soon as his feet touched the floor, the mirror of action pulsed again, sending a wave of light rippling across the hall. The cracks in the floor stopped spreading. The maze below them remained, but it no longer expanded. King Patri staggered backwards, staring at the mirror. His breath came fast, his hands shaking. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Before anyone could speak, a resounding thunderclap boomed from outside. Mira whipped around, her expression darkening. The storm! Kia and Neo followed her gaze towards the hall's entrance. Thick and heavy grey clouds churned above the city. The wind had picked up, swirling through the streets, rattling windows and pulling at fabric awnings. The storm was here. Mira's fists clenched. We don't have time. If we don't act now, Vidharma will be destroyed. Neo turned to Patri. We need to warn people. Patri exhaled, running a hand down his face. Even if we do, they won't listen. Kia took a step closer. Then we have to show them. Patri looked at her sharply. She pointed at the mirror of action. It responds to what we do, not just what we know. If we can make the people see their own reflections, or lack of them, maybe they'll understand what's at stake. For a moment, Patri hesitated. Then he did something unexpected. He nodded. Then let's go, he said. Mira blinked startled. Wait, you're actually coming with us? He let out a slow breath. I believe I've spent too long standing still. Kia and Neo exchanged a look. This was the first step, but there was still a long way to go. They had to reach the city before it was too late. The streets of Vidharma were in chaos. The once orderly avenues were filled with scattered papers and overturned carts, the wind howling between the towering libraries. Scholars, craftsmen, and healers stood frozen in place, staring up at the dark clouds above. But even now, they only debated what to do. Perhaps we should take shelter, one scholar suggested, or analyze the wind patterns first, another countered. Neo gritted his teeth. They're still arguing. Mira took a deep breath. Not for long. She turned to King Patri and said, You're their leader. You have to be the one to show them. Patri hesitated, his uncertainty still visible, but then he took a step forward, and then another. Kia motioned to the citizens. Bring them to the mirror of action. Mira ran to the nearest cluster of scholars, her voice strong and unwavering. Come with us. There's something you need to see. Some ignored her, lost in their discussions, but a few turned, frowning. King Patrick called out, his voice commanding but steady. The mirror of action has awakened. Come, see for yourselves. At first, only a handful followed, but as word spread, more and more people began to gather, drawn by the urgency in his voice. The wind howled around them as they hurried back towards the Hall of Reflections. When they arrived, the mirror of action stood gleaming, its surface shimmering with life. One by one, Vidharma citizens stepped in front of it, and one by one, they saw no reflections. Gasps filled the air. The scholars stared at the blank surface, their faces draining of color. It's it's not showing us, one whispered. Another's voice shook with fear. Why? Kia took a deep breath. Because the mirror doesn't just show what you look like, it shows what you understand and apply. She turned to them. You spent years learning, debating, gathering knowledge. But what have you done with it? Silence. Then a voice, soft at first, then louder. If that's true, then how do we fix it? Neo exhaled. This was the moment. The only way to restore your reflections is to act, he said, to use what you know to help others. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then a carpenter stepped forward. He looked down at his calloused hands, then at the storm battered streets outside. Without another word, he turned and began repairing a broken nearby door. As soon as he placed the first wooden plank, his reflection flickered into view. Gasps rang out. A healer knelt by an injured child, wrapping a bandage around his wound. Her reflection returned in full. The people began moving, slowly at first, then all at once, helping, repairing, acting, and as they did, their reflections came back. Kia felt something inside her stir with hope. It was working. But then a loud crash echoed through the sky. Mira's head snapped up. The storm's getting stronger. Patrick clenched his fists. We have to act faster. The people of Vidharma were finally moving, but the storm wasn't waiting for them. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, soaking the city streets. The wind whipped through the air, tearing at fabric awnings and knocking down signs. The mirror glowed brighter, almost as if it were helping them see the way forward. Kia turned to Neo. We have to help too. Neo grinned. Now this is a city-wide quest I can get behind. And together they ran into the storm, ready to act, ready to save Vidharma before it was too late. Chapter 6. A Race Against Time. The storm roared through Vidharma. The once orderly city was now a battleground against the elements. Winds tore through the streets, ripping cloth banners from their posts, while rain hammered against rooftops, threatening to flood the lower alleys. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the chaos below. Kia and Neo ran through the streets, their hearts pounding as they dodged falling signs and overturned carts. Around them, the people of Vidharma, newly awakened to action, scrambled to secure the city. Carpenters hammered boards over broken windows, builders strengthened crumbling structures, and healers worked swiftly to move the sick and elderly to safety. For the first time, Vidharma was alive with movement. But it wasn't enough. The storm was growing stronger, and the endless maze was still open. Neo skidded to a halt in the middle of the main plaza, panting. He looked back towards the Hall of Reflections, where the mirror of action still pulsed with light. Mira stood near it, watching in horrified silence as dark cracks continued to spread from the mirror's base. Despite everything, the endless maze hadn't closed. Mira's fist clenched. Why isn't it stopping? People are acting, they're changing. Kia's stomach twisted. It's not enough, she whispered. Neo exhaled. Then what's missing? And then a deep groan echoed from the maze's entrance. The ground shifted beneath them. Kia turned just in time to see a familiar figure standing dangerously close to the edge of the maze's gasping chasm. King Patri. His back was to them, his hands clenched into fists, his faint reflection flickered in the mirror's glow, but it was still weak, too weak. The truth struck Kia like lightning. The maze won't close, she whispered, because the person who led Vidharma into this state hasn't fully changed. Neo's eyes widened. Patri. Mira took a shaky step forward. He's still one of them. The wind howled, tugging at King Patri's dark robes, but he remained still, staring into the shifting abyss below. Kia stepped closer. You're still hesitating. Patri didn't turn to look at her. I was a fool, he said, his voice quiet. I spent years teaching my people that knowledge was enough, that action was secondary, and now... He finally looked at the mirror at his faint flickering reflection. His certainty was gone. Mira swallowed hard. You can fix this, she said, her voice firm but gentle, but not by standing there. Patry exhaled shakily. I don't know how. Neo let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Seriously? You're the leader of the most intelligent city in the world, and you don't know how to act? Patry's shoulders stiffened. Neo stepped forward, determination burning in his eyes. You spent your whole life teaching people to think, but what you don't get is that sometimes the answer isn't in a book. Sometimes you have to just jump in and do what's right. The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, Patry was silent. Then a deafening crack split the air. Kia gasped as the Hall of Reflections trembled, its stone pillars beginning to crumble. The storm had reached its peak. The moment everything began to collapse, King Patry moved. He turned sharply towards the nearest group of people, pointing towards the Hall of Records. Everyone, inside, now, he ordered. Secure the entrance and reinforce the walls. The scholars, who once would have hesitated, would have debated, obeyed immediately. Patry spun towards a cluster of builders struggling to carry wooden beams. The eastern walls won't hold. Reinforce them before the winds get stronger. They rushed to follow his command. Patry didn't stop. For the first time, he was leading with action. He helped lift fallen pillars, guided children and elders to safety, and directed teams of workers to strengthen Vidharma's defenses. The moment he lifted that first piece of fallen debris, his reflection in the mirror of action pulsed and then solidified. It was whole again. Mira gasped, It's working! And then came the maze. The ground beneath them stabilized, the dark cracks that had threatened to consume Vidadma sealing shut. The shifting labyrinth below began to fade, its twisted corridors dissolving into nothing. The endless maze was closing. For the first time, Vidadma was free. The last thing to fall was the storm. As the maze fully vanished, the mirror of action gave off one final pulse of light, sending a ripple through the blackened sky. Like a candle being blown out, the storm began to break. The clouds thinned, the violent winds calmed, and the torrential rain slowed to a light drizzle. Vidadma was saved. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then cheers erupted across the city. People laughed, cried, and embraced one another, relief washing over them in waves. Kia let out a deep breath, her muscles finally relaxing. Then she turned to Mira, whose face was lit with joy and disbelief. Mira smiled, her eyes glistening. For the first time in years, Vidadma was truly alive. King Patry stood near the mirror, watching his own full reflection for the first time in decades. He looked at his hands, his clothes dirtied from the storm and work, and exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time in his life, he bowed to his people, to his city. Cheers rang out once more. Mira's eyes shone with pride. He really changed, she whispered. Kia smiled, and so did Vidadma. Nia folded his arms. Honestly, I was kinda expecting him to argue about it for 3 more hours. Mira laughed. For the first time, Vidadma had a new future. But their mission was not quite complete. There was a rather important thing they had almost forgotten. Chapter 7 The Lost Ones Return. Mira stood at the edge of the Hall of Reflections, her eyes locked onto the ground where the endless maze had once yawned open. Though the streets above had healed, she could still feel a vast unseen presence beneath her feet. The maze was still there. The lost ones are still stuck inside, she whispered. Kia and Neo followed her gaze. Neo frowned. But why? The people changed. Shouldn't that have broken it? Kia shook her head. The ones who remained above had their reflections, but those who fell into the maze, they lost all sense of themselves. She let the words trail off, the truth settling over them like a shadow. Mira inhaled sharply. They're still trapped. King Patry, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. Then our work is not yet done, he said. His voice was steady, but for the first time there was determination in it, not just words, but action. The mirror of action shimmered again, its golden light spilling across the ground. Gasps rose from the gathered citizens as the illusion of solid stone dissolved, revealing the shifting labyrinth that still stretched below Vidharma. They could see them now, the lost ones, still inside, still wandering. Ghost like figures moving in endless circles, their faces locked in expressions of deep thought, never looking up, never moving forward. It was like watching a reflection of Vidharma's past, frozen in time. A woman near the front of the crowd let out a choked cry. That's my husband. A young boy clutched his mother's hand. Appa is still down there. Mira felt her breath catch as she spotted a familiar figure, her father, still standing among the scholars, locked in an endless debate with people who weren't even real. Her heart clenched. We have to get them out, she whispered. Neo crossed his arms. Don't worry, we won't leave until we help you get them out. Kia's expression hardened. If they don't even remember who they are, Kia murmured, then we need to remind them. She turned toward the mirror of action. And we're going to make them do it themselves. King Patri took a step forward. Those who wish to bring back their loved ones, come with us, he said. This will not be easy, but we cannot leave them behind. We must help them see the truth. One by one, people stepped forward, and together they descended into the endless maze. The moment they stepped through, the world around them warped. The maze was not a prison of walls, but a prison of the mind. To the lost ones, they were still in Vidharma. Libraries, debating halls, great open courtyards where discussions stretched for hours. The air was filled with questions that had no answers. Theoretical discussions are the foundation of knowledge. We must first define action before considering it. We must understand every possible outcome before we make a decision. Their voices stretched across years. Mira rushed through the maze, her pulse pounding. She spotted her father seated at a stone table, surrounded by shadowy figures, scribbling notes that never appeared on the parchment in front of him. Appa! He didn't react. Mira grabbed his arm, shaking him. Appa, look at me! His brow furrowed as if her voice barely reached him. I'm in the middle of an important discussion. She gritted her teeth. There is no discussion. You've been here for years. He ignored her, continuing to scribble words that didn't exist. Mira exhaled sharply. Fine, if words won't work, she'll show him. Mira reached to the table, grabbed one of the blank parchments, and threw it into the air. It floated down slowly, landing softly. Appa, she said, voice tense, if this is Vidharma, then tell me, why did that paper fall without a sound? Her father hesitated. Mira grabbed a book and dropped it on the floor. No thud, no echo. The shadowy scholars did not react. Her father frowned. That's... She stepped closer. Vidharma is real, and in Vidharma, objects make noise when they fall. Why didn't that? For the first time, his quill stopped moving, but the maze did not break. Mira clenched her fists. It wasn't enough. She took a deep breath, then asked, Appa, tell me, what did you eat yesterday? He blinked. Tell me what you ate last week, she pressed. Where did you sleep? When was the last time you walked in the city? His face twisted in confusion. I was just in Vidadma's library. I was reading a passage on... What season is it? She interrupted. He opened his mouth, then froze. The maze shuddered. His breathing grew unsteady. I don't... But still the illusion held. Mira's heart pounded. He needed to do something, something that would force him to reclaim himself. And then the idea struck her. Mira grabbed his hand and pressed a quill into his fingers. Write your name. Her father blinked. What? She shoved a parchment towards him. If this is real, if you are real, then prove it. Write your name. His brow furrowed, but he pressed the quill to the paper. He began to write. And then the ink vanished. His entire body stiffened. His breath hitched. What? He stared at the parchment, turning it over. Why isn't it staying? Mira stepped closer. Because you don't exist here. Her father's hands trembled. Mira reached into her satchel, pulled out a real scroll, and slammed it in front of him. Try again, she commanded. If you say who you say you are, then prove it. Slowly, he picked up the quill again. This time, as he wrote, the ink stayed. His name appeared, and the moment it did, his reflection snapped back into place. His breath caught. He stared at the letters, his fingers tracing them over and over. I'm here, he whispered. Mira's throat tightened. Yes, you are. She grabbed his hand. Now come home. As Mira's father left the maze, Mira turned to the others. Make them write their names, she shouted. Kia and Neo understood immediately and rushed to get parchment quills and ink from the village, which they distributed to the rescuers. The Vidharma rescuers sprang into action, shoving parchment and quills into the hands of their lost loved ones. A woman grabbed her husband's hand. Write it! If you're real, prove it! A young apprentice pushed a quill into his lost teacher's grip. You taught me how to write my name, but I have forgotten. Can you show me how you write your name? A son shoved a scroll into his mother's lap. You can't be lost if you know who you are. One by one, the lost ones wrote. And one by one, they broke their illusions and escaped the maze to see their reflections returned. As the last of the lost ones stepped out, the labyrinth shifted, but it was still there, beneath Vidadma, waiting. King Patri gazed at the shifting corridors. The maze is not a curse, he murmured. It is a warning, a lesson even. Mira exhaled, and if anyone gets lost again, we'll find them. Vidadma was whole again, and this time they would never forget themselves. Chapter 8: A New Future for Vidadma. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city transformed. Vidadma, once a place of endless debate and stagnation, was now alive with movement and purpose. The streets, once filled only with scholars arguing over theories, were now bustling with builders, healers, and craftsmen working side by side. The air, once heavy with empty words, now carried the sounds of hammering, laughter, and intent footsteps. The mirror of action stood tall at the heart of it all, its surface gleaming in the fresh morning light. Kia and Neo stood before it, their reflections strong and clear. Mira ran her fingers along its polished edge, smiling. For years I thought this mirror was broken, she turned to them. But it wasn't, was it? Neo shook his head. No, the people just stopped being able to see themselves in it. Kia smiled softly, because they stopped acting on what they knew. Mira's reflection in the mirror was full and steady now, her eyes brighter than ever. She turned back to the city. It feels different, she admitted. I always thought Vidhanma was full of life, but now, for the first time, it actually feels alive. Neo nudged her, probably because, for the first time, it is. From the steps of the Hall of Reflections, King Patri surveyed his city. He no longer wore his elaborate royal robes. His sleeves were rolled up, his once pristine attire dirtied from the work of rebuilding. There was no longer an air of superiority about him, only resolve. For the first time in decades, his reflection in the mirror of action was strong. He turned to address the people. For too long, Vidharma has stood still, he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. We called ourselves the most intelligent city in the world, but knowledge without action is meaningless. Wisdom is not found in words alone, it is found in what we choose to do. The crowd listened in silence, truly hearing him for the first time. Patri exhaled, his shoulders loosening slightly. From this day forward, Vidharma will be a place of both learning and action. The mirror of action will no longer stand in the shadows. It will stand as a reminder that our reflections are shaped by what we do. A wave of agreement swept through the people. Mira smiled to herself. He finally understands, she murmured. Neo nudged her. And so does everyone else. Patri looked out over the gathered citizens. Let today mark the first step of our new Vidadma, he declared. Let us act, let us build, let us truly live what we learn. The cheers that erupted in response were unlike anything Kia and Neo had ever heard before. It wasn't just noise, it was a promise. Vidadma had changed. A familiar voice rang out behind them. You did well. They turned to see King Patri standing tall. Patri turned to Kia and Neo. You two are not from here, are you? Kia hesitated. It's complicated. Patri nodded. Then I will not ask. He placed a hand over his chest in a gesture of deep respect. But know this, You have done something that even the wisest among us could not. You reminded us that knowledge is nothing if it is not used. Kia felt a warmth spread through her chest. Mira crossed her arms. And I suppose you won't be forgetting that lesson any time soon. Patry smiled. No, he said, I will not. Mira took a step closer to the mirror, her heart hammering in her chest. For so long, she had watched the city slip deeper into inaction. She had tried to speak out, tried to shake people awake, but she had been afraid too, afraid of what might happen if she pushed too hard, afraid of standing alone. But not anymore. She stood before the mirror of action, her dark eyes steady as she gazed into its gleaming surface. For a split second, there was nothing. Then, a bright, solid reflection stared back at her, whole, strong, unshakable. A choked laugh escaped her lips, and she quickly covered her mouth, embarrassed at the sudden rush of emotion. Kia placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it. Mira turned to them, her voice trembling with quiet wonder. We all did. Chapter 9. Returning to Thiruvalluvar. Kia and Neo knew it was time to leave. Mira hugged them tightly, smiling gratefully. Because of you, my father is home, and Vidharma is finally alive again, she said. I won't let us forget this lesson. Are you sure you don't want to stay a little longer? Mira asked, looking between them. Neo sighed dramatically. As much as I'd love to stick around and build the next great city of action, we kind of have our own things to get back to. Mira smiled. I understand. Kia hesitated before speaking. What about you? She asked. What will you do now? Mira took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to fight to be heard, she admitted. I don't have to just argue about what needs to change. I can actually help make it happen. She squared her shoulders. I'm going to help rebuild Vidharma. Not just the buildings, but the way people live here. Neo grinned. That sounds like a pretty solid plan. Mira smirked. Yeah, I thought so too. Kia felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle inside her. This wasn't just a victory, this was a new beginning. They stood together for a long moment, watching the city move with a purpose it had never known before. Kia turned to Mira and squeezed her hand. We'll see you again, Mira. Mira's eyes softened. I hope so. As the golden light faded, Kia and Neo felt solid ground beneath their feet once more. The scent of aged parchment, earth, and ink filled the air. They looked around, the stone courtyard, the towering tree overhead, its leaves rustling softly, and the scrolls neatly stacked on the wooden shelves nearby. They were back, standing before Thiruvalluvar's wooden desk. He was seated as before, his quill poised over parchment, his eyes calm and knowing, as if he had been expecting them all along. He studied them for a moment before speaking. You have returned. Neo exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, but that was way more intense than last time. Kia, still catching her breath, gave a small smile. But it was worth it. Thiruvalluvar nodded pleased. He gestured to the mats before him, inviting them to sit. Tell me, what have you learned? Neo flopped onto a mat, rubbing his temples. That debating for hours doesn't actually fix anything. Thiruvalluvar let out a quiet chuckle. A wise observation, but I believe you have learned something deeper than that. His gaze rested on Kia. She hesitated. Then slowly she spoke. I think I think we finally understand what you meant about knowledge being useless without action. Neo sat up nodding. Yeah, all those scholars knew so much, but none of it mattered because they never did anything. Thiruvalluvar's expression remained thoughtful. And what of the maze? Kia shivered slightly, remembering the lost ones trapped inside, endlessly debating, not even realizing they were no longer real. She exhaled. It wasn't just a place, it was a state of being, a warning of what happens when people stop moving forward. Thiruvalluvar nodded. Indeed, a mind that does not act is a mind trapped in its own illusion. Neo frowned. But it's weird. The maze didn't disappear. Why is it still there? Thiruvalluvar's gaze darkened slightly, his fingers tracing the edge of the parchment before him. Because there will always be those who forget. He looked up, his voice steady. The maze will always exist for those who abandoned action for thought alone. It will remain for those who forget that true wisdom is not in words, but in what we do. Neo exhaled. So basically, it's like a giant don't get stuck sign. A deep chuckle rumbled from Tiruvallur's chest. You could say that. He leaned forward slightly. But tell me, how did you bring back the lost ones? Kia smiled. We made them write their names. It was the only way they could prove to themselves that they existed. Neo nodded. Yeah, at first they didn't even realize they were gone, but when they saw that their names wouldn't stay on the parchment, it was like their minds snapped awake. Tiruvallur's eyes gleamed with approval. A powerful lesson indeed. To know oneself, to truly know oneself, is the first step towards action. He reached for his quill, dipped it into dark ink, and began to write onto the parchment before him. Kia and Neo leaned in, watching as his elegant script formed the words Katradhanal Aya Payanenkol Valarivan Natral Tolar Enin. Neo's eyebrows furrowed. What does it say? Tiruvallavad lifted his gaze, his voice steady and clear. What is the use of learning if it does not lead to true wisdom? The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that sank into their bones. Kia and Neo exchanged a look. They understood. They had lived this lesson. Before they could respond, the parchment glowed faintly, and the world around them began to shift once more. The stone courtyard, the great tree, Tiruvallava's wise gaze, everything faded into golden light. Chapter 10 Party's Wisdom. A familiar warmth wrapped around them as Kia and Neo landed softly on the wooden floor of Party's shed. The scent of old books, dried herbs, and fresh morning air filled their senses. Neo blinked rapidly. Whoa, that was awesome! He turned sharply towards the old mirror leaning against the wall. It was just a mirror. No glow, no shimmer, just an ordinary reflection staring back at them. Yet, something felt different. Kia slowly walked towards it, studying her own reflection. Neo stepped beside her. Do you see that? She nodded. For the first time, she wasn't just seeing her reflection, she was seeing herself. They had changed. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. They followed the call. As they made their way towards the house, they saw Party in the kitchen. What are you two doing up so early? Kia and Neo turned to see their party standing at the doorway, her eyes filled with quiet amusement. Kia shrugged. We just couldn't sleep. Party stepped inside, dusting flour from her hands. She said thoughtfully. And why is that? Neo hesitated, then glanced at Kia. She smiled. We were just thinking about what it really means to learn something. Party raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what does it mean? Kia looked down at her hands. That learning is useless if you don't act on it. Neo leaned back. Yeah, otherwise it's just words. Party chuckled. Sounds like my lessons are finally starting to make sense. Kia and Neo exchanged a look. Party smiled. Now, if you're up so early, you might as well help me make breakfast. Neo groaned dramatically. Oh, so much for resting. Kia laughed. Come on, future philosopher, let's do something for a change. As they followed their party into the kitchen, a cool morning breeze swept through the open door, carrying with it the promise of another journey. But for now, they were home. For now. And that's the end of this episode of Kural Inspired Stories. So, what did Kia and Neo's journey through Vidharma teach you? Maybe it's a reminder that knowledge shines brightest when we turn it into action. But don't just listen and move on. Take action today. Grab a copy of The Mirror and the Endless Maze on Amazon and dive into the reflection activities at the back of the book. They're designed to help you think deeper, apply what you've learned, and take your own journey of growth. The link's in the description. Go for it. And get ready because Kia and Neo's next adventure is their most dangerous yet. In the upcoming episode, they'll be pulled into a world where time itself is disappearing, and they must follow a mysterious lotus path filled with forgotten cities, lost souls, and hidden wisdom. With everything at stake, can they complete the trials before time runs out? Join me for the next adventure in the lotus path and the eternal wisdom. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep taking action. You've got this.